Now that we have completely understood how we derive the aggregate supply curve in the Keynesian model, how we derive the aggregate demand curve in the Keynesian model, the only topic left to talk about is what are the policy implications on the aggregate supply and demand in the Keynesian model given government monetary and government fiscal policies. Because this is not high school, I'll be explaining the policy, how do I put this? Just a quick recap, whenever the money supply in the economy increases, the LM curve shifts towards the right, and whenever the money supply decreases, the LM curve shifts towards the left. Whenever we have fiscal policies, whenever we have expansionary fiscal policies, the IS curve shifts towards the right, and whenever we have contractionary fiscal policy, the IS curve shifts towards the left. But always keep in mind, whenever we have fiscal policies, there's always going to be a crowding out effect. There's always going to be a crowding out effect in the IS curve. So now that we have the basic recap and the basic knowledge, let's just get on to what happens if we have an increase in aggregate demand in the economy through fiscal and monetary policy. Let's start with monetary policy first. Let's say the government implements monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy to increase money supply in the economy, to increase a nominal money supply in the economy. So that would mean that we are increasing M0. Let's say M0 goes from M0 to, let's say, M1. The money supply has increased. So prices are still constant at the moment. When that happens, we know from our basic understanding that the LM curve would shift towards the right. So if the LM curve shift, let's just call this point, let's call this M2, let's call this LM1. This is LM1. The LM curve will shift towards the right. Let me just zoom in for a second. Okay. The LM curve will shift towards the right, and this would theoretically increase, take a different color. This would theoretically increase the output from Y0 to Y2. And this would decrease the interest rate from Y1, from I0 to I2, sorry, from I1 to I2. But since we're talking about aggregate demand over here, we would not pay a lot of attention to interest rate. That does not concern us at the moment. However, what's going to happen when the aggregate supply, when the aggregate, sorry, my mistake. So whenever the GDP would increase in the LM curve, this is gonna cause a shift in the aggregate demand on the Keynesian aggregate demand and supply. So let's say the aggregate demand goes from AD1 to, let's just call this point AD2, and let's just coin this equilibrium point over here as Y2. What would that do? That would increase GDP. That is great, we know that, but at the same time that would cause the prices to increase. The prices would go from P0 to, let's just call this point over here P1, and whenever the prices increase, this is going to have an effect on the LM curve. We know that the initial prices were P0. If prices increase, let's call this M1. If prices go from P0 to P1, this would cause a reduction. This would cause a reduction in the LM curve. Now, how does that make sense? Let's say that the initial money supply, initial nominal money supply was 10. Let's say the initial price level was, let's say, 2. If the money supply increases from, let's say, 10 to 20 and the price level remains the same, we would have a total output of, let's take a different color. We would have a total output of 5. We would have a total output of 10. This is output in the sense GDP would be 5 units. Now it becomes 10 units. But if the price level increases, let's say the price level increases from 2 to 4. Let's make it 5. 2 to 5. That would reduce our GDP from 10. This would reduce our GDP to 15. No, not 15. My mistake. 10 divided by 5 is 4. Reduce GDP to 4. The point is, let's call this point Y0, Y1, we will call this point Y3. The point is the LM curve will shift towards the right initially, but when the prices increase due to increase in aggregate demand, the LM curve would shift leftward slightly. So the LM curve would shift leftward slightly. So let's just call this point over here LM3. This is LM3. So LM3, LM2, LM1. So what's going to be the total overall effect? The total overall effect will be the aggregate output or the income in the economy would increase, but would not increase to the theoretical level, meaning it should theoretically go from y1 to y2, but because of increase in prices we are going to see a leftward shift of LM curve eventually, and therefore it will go from y1 to y3 instead of going to y2. We could see the opposite effect given that the money supply in the economy decreases. If the money supply in the economy decreases, we would have an opposite inverse effect. However, the government mainly implements expansionary monetary policy, so this is very unlikely to happen in real life. To summarize it again, I know it can be a little bit mouthful. Just keep in mind, whenever we have an increase in monetary policy, whenever the money supply increases, the LM curve shifts towards the right. However, this causes the AD, which is aggregate demand curve, to shift towards the right in the aggregate demand and supply schedule, and that will cause increase in prices. The increase in prices would reduce the real value for money, and therefore our LM curve would shift back a little bit, and therefore our income or the output level would increase, but would not increase by a high amount. But this also depends on the This also depends on the elasticity of the IS-lM curve, which is a different topic altogether. I would not go into that topic. It will just make it even more complicated. But make sure you watch the previous videos to understand the actual effect given different elasticities of IS-lM curves. In this example, I'll keep things very straightforward. So now let's talk about IS policies. Let's quickly remove this. Let's talk about what's going to happen if government implements fiscal policy. If government implements expansionary fiscal policy, this is going to cause the LM curve. Sorry, my mistake. If the government implements fiscal policy, this is going to cause expansionary fiscal policy. This would cause the IS curve to shift towards the right. Let me just draw it further apart just so that we can draw a diagram more clearly. The IS curve will shift towards the right. One thing to keep in mind is you can look at the entire equation inversely. If the IS curve shifts towards the left, that would mean the government is implementing contractionary fiscal policy. Again, if you haven't studied what causes the shift in IS-lM curve, make sure you watch that video beforehand. Let's say the government implements expansionary fiscal policy and that causes the IS curve to shift towards the right, as we'll probably guess from the diagram. If that happens, this would cause, if let's say this is our initial equilibrium, let's call it y0. Let's say this is our final equilibrium y1. Let's say we have over here interest rate I0, cause the interest rate I1. Since we are only discussing aggregate demand and price in this video, we will not go into the effects on interest rate for now. But let's say that we have an increase in output in the economy. If you have an increase in output in the economy, that would cause the IS curve shift towards the right. But at the same time, this would cause the AD curve to shift towards the right, just as the previous example described. When the AD curve shifts towards the right, that would cause an increase in prices. So the prices would increase. When the prices increase, what's going to happen to the IS-lM curve? When the prices increase, as I've already explained in the previous example, on the previous situation, when the prices increase, this would cause a leftward shift of the LM curve. So the LM curve would go back or go leftward. Let's call it LM2. Let's call it LM1. The LM curve goes back. The IS curve goes towards the right. And that would create a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium, let's just call that new equilibrium Y3. So the IS curve will shift towards the right, and then the IS curve or the LM curve will shift towards the left, and that would decrease the value for the total output. In other words, theoretically we should be going from Y0 to Y1, but because of increase in prices, we would go from Y0 to Y3 instead of going from Y0 to Y1. Now, how much track back we would have, essentially how far back would we go from Y1 to Y3? That depends on the crowding out effect, and that depends on the elasticities of IS curve, which is a different topic altogether. But for this video, we'll keep things simple. It's already getting very complicated. Just keep in mind, whenever the IS curve shifts towards the right, that would cause an increase in output level. That increase in output level will cause our AD to shift towards the right, and when the AD shifts towards the right, that would cause an increase in prices. And and therefore we would see a leftward shift in the LM curve, and that would reduce our overall shift in the aggregate output in the economy. But one thing that I want you guys to remember is if this is our aggregate supply in the Keynesian model, let's say the aggregate demand curve is somewhere over here. If the aggregate demand is somewhere over on the horizontal side, then any shift in aggregate demand would not have any significant effect on prices in the Keynesian model, and therefore we would have no impact on the LM side because the prices are constant. So if there is no shift on the LM side, we would see a theoretical increase from Y0 to Y1. Something very important to keep in mind when we explain these type of curves.